All right, our speaker for tonight is Nick Cairns. Nick is a naturalist, herpetologist, and curator of non-avian vertebrates at the Royal Alberta Museum. He really likes lizards and learning how reptiles spend the winter. He has also worked on turtles, frogs, and snakes. And with that, Nick, thank you for being here. I will give you the mic.
Well, Nick, thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks to Nature Alberta for having me. And I'm so happy that everyone found this an interesting enough subject to log on and join us today. So thank you very much, Nick, for having me. As Nick mentioned, my name is also Nick, and I am curator of non-avian vertebrates, and I do like lizards. So before we get too deep into things today, I have a number of people to thank that have made the projects that I'm going to talk about possible. First off, Lori Pepperbrink and the Horned Lizard Conservation Society actually provided me with the funds to purchase the thermal loggers that I originally started this project with before I started at the Royal Alberta Museum. And then I've received permits and assistance from all sorts of Parks Canada staff, Fish and Wildlife folks from Alberta. There's been lots of fantastic locals that have helped me and people that have given me advice, as well as friends and family that have joined me in the field. So I do want to appreciate that I've not done this stuff by myself. On top of that, I do want to thank the Royal Alberta Museum, and particularly Sean McFadden, who has been with me for every step of this since I joined the museum. So now Nick's already introduced you to myself, but I want to show you pictures of me at a younger age. I have been very lucky in my career thus far to be able to study a pretty wide variety of creatures, and I've enjoyed a lot of different taxa. I've worked on small snakes in Manitoba. I've worked on turtles in Ontario, and I've worked on frogs across North America. I've helped in museums in a couple of different countries, and I've been very, very lucky to do so. But there's one group that I keep coming back to, and that's lizards. I think I probably find them to be the most interesting group of organisms I can think of. They have endlessly fascinating biologies. They have very cool diversity, and they have a lot of stereotypes that go with them. You know, when you think of a lizard, what do you think of? Because when I think of a lizard, this is pretty much what I think of. It's a chuckwalla. This is, in my mind, a pretty bog standard lizard, a bit bigger than the average lizard, I suppose, but looks like a very standard lizard. You got your forelegs, you got your tummy, you got a long tail, and a bit of a chunky head. Now, this one happens to be a vegetarian, lives on rock faces, climbs down to eat the flowers off of desert plants. I also usually think of lizards in deserts. Another desert lizard. There's a bit of a variation on a theme. This one's a bit stretched out, a bit of a pointier on both ends. This is a sand monitor from Western Australia. This one would be a near apex predator in its environment, eating mammals, reptiles, meat, and large insects. And then there's other teeny tiny bug hunters like this Western tree della, also from Western Australia. This one was underneath a rock that you can see it's still clinging to. So quite a bit of variation in size. There's also quite a bit of variation in shape and biology in terms of the way that these organisms are put together. And speaking of the way they're put together, morphologically, there's a ton of variation, especially in the number of legs and the development level of legs. So you could only have a couple legs with maybe a couple toes on each leg, like this Sharkbray broad-blazed slider, if you ever needed a tongue-twisting lizard species to work with. Or you could have almost no legs at all, like this Burton's legless lizard, which is actually a legless gecko. The one on the top right there is the slider. That's a Larista skink, so it's a type of skink. And then the one on the bottom is actually a legless gecko called a pygopod. And this one happens to be Burton's legless lizard, which is one of the most widespread lizards in Australia. It just has little flaps for feet. And then you also have those lizards that don't really have feet at all, because leglessness and leg reduction is extremely common in lizards. And this happens to be a Western mud snake. This one's from Arkansas. Now, snakes just happen to be a group of lizards. In fact, if you consider geckos lizards, snakes are more closely related to iguanas than they are to geckos. So if you consider geckos lizards, then you have to consider snakes lizards. That's just kind of the end of it. But once you add in the snakes, you have about 12,000 members of the lizards or the squamates. And it's a huge and diverse group, as I've just shown you a little taste of. But even within that diversity, they still have some basic limits. So when you think of lizards and lizard habitats, what do you think of? And the main one that I think of is temperature. When I think of a lizard, I think of an organism sitting in a desert in the heat, like this Mojave fringe-toed lizard. Um, these lizards need to find a way to stay warm because they are exothermic. They're cold-blooded, as it were. They have to have a way to stay warm enough to find food, to catch food, to digest their food, and to make more lizards. So they have this restriction on the temperatures that they can live in. And that means that most lizards live in warm areas. So this is a map from the GUARD database. It shows reptile richness. So it's not just lizards, but lizards make up the vast majority of species of reptiles. So we can kind of use this as a pretty solid proxy. And you can see that most lizards are living in those warm places. The redder the color, the more species. So you can see in places in Southern Africa, Northern South America, Central America, you're getting upwards of 176 to 206 species of lizards in 1 2 kilometer block. So some lizards have real high diversity. And you can see as you get north, you can see in Sweden and Finland, there's still lizards. So they can operate in cool temperatures, but like Finland and Sweden, Alberta is not just cool, it is very cold. This is a very cold place to be a reptile. Now, we still have quite a few lizards. And again, I'm using lizards in the broad sense. What I mean here is squamates. We'll talk about lizard versus lizard and what our four-legged lizards are going to be called. We'll simplify it in a minute. But let's get through our legless lizards first. We have at least 8 species of squamates in Alberta. We have 3 garter snakes. I don't know if you can see my little cursor here, but we've got the wandering garter snake. We've got the red-sided garter snake. We've got the ever pretty plains garter snake. We've got prairie rattlesnakes. We've got bull snakes, the enigmatic hognose snake, talented actor, and pretty interesting species. And then we have our most recent addition to Alberta's known fauna, the yellow-bellied racer, which was added to our list of species of Alberta in 2014. Of course, they were there before that, but that's just when we finally sort of got around to adding them to the list. So we know they can survive in a lot of places, but how do they make a go of it here? Now, there's a number of traits relating to diet and the way they eat, how much they eat, their reproductive biology that probably make living in colder places easier for the long-term persistence of a species. But for now, we're going to talk about how they just basically survive winter individually. And that is by brumation. So brumation is a lot like hibernation for exothermic animals, for cold-blooded animals. And it's a bit different from an animal that makes its own heat because they don't have to shut down physiological processes that make heat. They just are colder. And essentially what it means is they can still be awake. They can still even move around. They're just slower. They're on an energy-saving mode. So that balance between energy and then the second half of that question is freezing. So there's 2 problems. You don't want to burn through all your fat and starve to death before the end of winter. So you want to be cold, but you don't want to freeze. So you can't be that cold. And so most reptiles use deep holes to get below the frost line. And that frost line is basically how deep the freezing temperature, so how deep 0 degrees Celsius penetrates into the soil. And so finding that balance between saving energy and freezing is what dictates how deep they go. And so at different times of the year, at different areas, they're going to be different depths. So it's hard to make generalizations necessarily for one species across a broad area. But generally, they do have to go fairly deep. So this is a figure from an overwintering paper that I wrote when I was living in Manitoba, and it's looking at small snake species. And it sort of shows these lines here. You got your y-axis is temperature, your x-axis is season or month. And what it's showing is as you progress through the season, all the temperatures are decreasing through the middle of winter, reaching their peak in early to late spring. And the deeper you go, the more stable it is. So even when you're almost 4 feet deep at 120 centimeters, it's still basically going to freezing. These temperatures all reflect the temperatures in an ant mound. So it's actually quite similar to the temperatures around the ant mound, but it provides easier access for the snakes to get into it. So we were finding snakes well below 120 centimeters. And they were actually going and actually sitting in the water at the bottom of the ant mound. So they were actually entering the water table to make sure that they didn't freeze. There is one reptile that bucks this trend of getting really deep and avoiding those questions, and that is our greater shorthorn lizard, our only lizard in Alberta with 4 legs. Now, I'm going to switch back to the more typical meaning of lizard at this point. I'm going to move away from lizard as a synonym for squamate and go back to lizard meaning sort of generally 4-legged, blocky, chuckwalla-esque looking animal. And so compared to a chuckwalla, greater shorthorn lizards are quite a bit smaller. They're what I would call sort of a mid-sized lizard. They max out at about 80 millimeters body size, so from the tip of their snout to their vent. And they weigh about 20 grams for a female. So it's about the size of a large mouse. The males are about 2/3 that size, so they're a bit smaller, and they're about half that mass, so they're a little narrower as well. Now, I'm going to take a bit of an aside to talk about the biology of this species, and we'll go back to winter in a little bit in terms of snow and cold. Basically, let's get through Phrynosoma first, because I think these are one of the most fascinating groups of reptiles out there. There are 17 species. The genus Phrynosoma translates into the word toad-bodied. So whenever you're talking to someone and they refer to them as horny toads, they might just be speaking Latin to you, because basically the first people that saw these were like, oh, that looks like a toad to me. Now, there's some obvious differences between them and your typical buffonid toad, but they generally do have wide bodies. They're generally fairly heavy bodied, with a lot of their weight being carried towards their back legs. And so toad's not the worst comparison you could give them. Now, while their generic name is relative to their sort of body shape, their English common name refers to the quite spectacular horns you can see. There's quite a diversity in horns in this genus, and they're all outgrowths of bone, so they're true horns. And then they're covered, of course, with scales and other integument. What is not mentioned in any of their names that I can find is that they are the bane of all ants. As a group, they are sometimes very extremely specialized to ants. Others a little bit less so, but for the most part, this group eats ants. And you can see some of the variation between these groups. So there's all these long, prickly horned ones with really sort of clustered horns, ones with very standardized sort of 4 horns poking straight back. And then we have the short-horned lizards. And that is where our Phrynosoma hernandezi belongs. Now, that whole lineage of short-horned lizards, along with having short horns, has a couple other similarities that actually are usually associated with cool climates. And that's because most of the members within this group are upland, like mountain dwellers. They also tend to be less specialized, and this might be one of those sort of adaptations to living in a cool climate. You might not always have as many ants as you would like at your disposal. So they have become less specialized in ants and are quite capable of eating fairly large prey. You can see the one on the left-hand side here is eating a tiger beetle. That's a cowpath tiger beetle. And then you can see the one on the right is eating a Pard's grasshopper. Um, Now, to eat these larger prey, they also have much more robust lower jaws. Their mandibles are more robust than other members of the genus. So their skulls are very distinctive from a number of different ways. The other thing about this whole group is that they tend to give live birth, which is unusual because most of the members of the genus are egg layers. So that is a neonate on my middle finger, and that one would be only a couple days old. So pretty small, but not as small as you would think, considering. But one of those things about giving live birth means that you can control the temperature where your offspring are developing, as opposed to if you lay eggs in a hole, they're basically the temperature of that hole. So if the sun shines on the site where the hole is, then the heat will percolate down into the soil and warm up your eggs. But if you're keeping them with you, that means you can warm them at the same pace you would warm your body. And it means you can speed up the development, which helps if you're, say, high in a mountain range or high latitude in a place like southern Alberta. You can see this map on the right-hand side shows the general proportion. If you look at the bottom half of that, it shows the general proportion of viviparous squamates. And you can see as you get to colder areas like northern North America or northern Europe or the Gobi Desert or New Zealand, you get a lot more species that give live birth, or viviparous species. Now, that does make for some problems because you would imagine lugging around your babies as opposed to dropping them off with the dirt sitter. Is more investment time for the mother. And in the case of Phrynosoma hernandezi in Canada, that means an absolutely massive amount of maternal investment. Horned lizard babies are big. That is a baby that was born within hours of this picture being taken. There were several other babies right by this female, so they were quite close. And again, that baby's as big as her head. And these females can have between 6 and 17, 18 babies in Canada. Those numbers are not, they get even more when they get down in the States. And that means that some of these females are doubling their body mass between May when they breed and the early August when they give birth. So that means that these babies take up a huge amount of effort, so much so that the females actually struggle sometimes to find food or move around. So the babies can make up 69% of the mother's postpartum weight. So that would be like a 150-pound person carrying a 103-pound baby. So that's actually probably the highest relative clutch mass I know of any lizard. I can't find a number that's higher than that. It's hard to say that because a lot of species haven't really been measured in this way. That's a relatively specific measure. But it is just a hint as to how extreme this lizard has to get to live in a place like southern Alberta. You can see this one here. She's so full of babies that you can see her ribs getting pushed in, but by the force of babies, not by the force of starvation, although she might be starving at the same time because she was not particularly mobile. Now, they're extreme, but they're also extremely adaptable. So greater short-horned lizards live across a huge range. Here's the map from iNaturalist. And they live basically all the way from southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan, all the way to the Sierra Madres of central Mexico. So massive, massive range. And in southern Mexico, or in Mexico through to the southern states, they're actually found usually in upland and mountain habitats like the picture you see above. Those mountains there are the Chiricahuas in Arizona. And that's where these lizards are found in upland habitats. You do find them occasionally on the flats in the desert, but for the most part in the uplands. And as they go through the Great Plains, they get to more grassland habitats. You start finding them on prairie dog towns. You find them in badlands as you get further north. And eventually, when they get to Canada, they're found basically exclusively in the hottest, most open, most dry habitats you can find. And these are mostly badlands and south-facing river valleys. So areas with lots of southern exposures, lots of heat. And they also live on almost exclusively one type of substrate, and that's bear paw shale. Now, bear paw shale is Cretaceous seafloor. It's a very open substrate. It can be sort of crushed, sometimes into a fine dust. Sometimes it looks a little hard pan. Other times it forms these tiny little plates. But all of these erode very easily, and they're usually fairly open because plants don't really like to grow on bear paw shale very much. Now, of course, living in an open south-facing environment in southern Alberta and Saskatchewan in the summer is going to lead to some pretty high ground temperatures. These ground temperatures quickly surpass the preferred body temperature of these lizards. You can find these lizards at extreme temperatures. And that means that they have to modify that so that they don't denature all their proteins and die a horrible death baking to death on some flat little piece of shale. And that means they spend much of their life actively thermoregulating, shuttling themselves between sites to balance their body temperatures, trying to, before they get too hot, moving to a cooler spot, and before they get too cold, moving to a hotter spot. And this figure shows a number of different temperatures. So basically, when we capture a lizard, we take three measurements. We take its ventral temperature first so that it doesn't have a chance to change. So we get the ventral temperature of the animal on its belly. And then we get a temperature in the nearest sun, which is the green line, and the nearest shade, which is the red line. And then the ventral is the blue line here. And so we can use this graph to sort of plot the daily activity of your average lizard. And you can see in the morning, they're out in the sun, matching that sun temperature really closely. And then they burst through 30, hit 35, and start realizing that maybe they should spend a little more time in the shade so that they don't get up to 40 degrees where they start to denature proteins. And you'll see during that sort of before lunchtime, they're shuttling between hot and sun and out looking for food and moving back into the shade. And then by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they're exclusively in the shade. And if it's really hot, they'll sort of smush themselves into beside rocks. And they almost look, for an animal that's quite saucer shaped, it's almost like they smush themselves into like caulking in a bathtub. They can really smush themselves into a really neat sort of shape. And then as it gets a little bit cooler in the evening, they start to venture out again, get back into the sun, try and get their temperature to stay around that 30 degrees, 35 degrees that they want to be at until eventually temperatures catch up with them and they go to bed for the night. Now, that's how these lizards live in the hot season, and lizards, for the most part, are evolved to deal with heat and this sort of temperatures. Again, we're getting temperatures over 55, 60 degrees even in some of them. But how do they deal with winter? How do they deal with this? How do they make it go here? Because our limiting factor is not our summers. As anyone that lives in Alberta can attest, our limiting factors are not our summers. Maybe in Florida, but not here. And as you would expect from our discussions about those snakes, I imagine you would guess that they go underground, and they do. They, in fact, dig their own burrows like this female did, and sometimes they use pre-existing burrows. Now, they're not ideally shaped to be diggers. They're quite flat and wide, and they've got fairly short limbs. They have to move a lot of soil to get their bodies underground. And we only find them digging, again, on this bear paw shale. It's soft and it's largely free of plant roots. So without that vegetation, it probably allows them to dig easier than if they were digging into black soil with lots of grass roots. But the thing about their digging is they don't go very far down. Larry Powell and Anthony Russell did find that they tend to bury themselves very shallowly, so only about 7 centimeters underground, 7 to 10. And based on what we know from the penetration of the frost line in most parts of Canada, let alone the prairies, that's not deep enough. However, Larry and Tony also noticed the persistence of snow at these sites. And these sites often included washes or little blowouts that kind of trap the snow for longer than areas around it. And they're catching blowing snow, not the snow that's sort of falling there, but the snow that's blown in there. And this suggests that maybe the lizards are choosing these sites for more snow. And that led to a couple of different hypotheses. The first two hypotheses kind of figure pretty well into each other. Essentially, like, what does the snow do, and does it stop it from freezing? So maybe the snow does stop the temperatures from freezing. If that lizard can get lower than another lizard sort of overwintering on the flats, maybe that extra depth stops it from freezing. Or maybe it just stabilizes it. So it's providing that stability while stopping it from freezing. So maybe they can find that perfect balance of low temperature without freezing. Or maybe freezing is not the problem, and what they need is stability, and that insulator of snow just stabilizes the temperature, but the animal still freezes. Now, this would be biologically complicated because then the animal would have to freeze, and freeze tolerance is really rare in reptiles. But if we want to look at any of these questions, we first need to find them. And so, thanks to a fantastic group of volunteers, both with Parks Canada and with the Royal Alberta Museum, that's what we do. We get out in late summer and we scour the prairies in lizard habitat to try and find a good number of lizards in a relatively small area so that we can track them back to their overwintering sites. Once we find them, we add 2 bits of kit to them to make sure that we can find them again. One, we put little radio tags on them. You can see an adult female here with the radio tag. We put them on with silicone, and then we cover the silicone in local dust so that it doesn't ruin their brilliant camouflage. And then we also insert a pit tag in them, and that allows us to have an individual identification for the lizard. It also allows us to find them underground, which means that we can find exactly where they are. So we can use the radio tags to get close. And then once we get to an area, we can just scan them with the pit tag scanner. And it's like going to the grocery store. You hear the beep, 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 and you know which individual you've had. So it actually works well enough that this year we were able to find one that we only have a certain number of radio tags that we can purchase because they're quite expensive. And we were able to find some with just the pit tags. So this has been a really fun addition to this project, just because it gives us a much better resolution on the site. So once we find a site that's occupied, we add data collection equipment. And we also add an identical data collection equipment suite to a control site that's about 10 meters away from the original site. So to each site, we add an I button, which is just a little thermal logger. And then that collects temperatures at 10 centimeters underground, and it takes a reading every 4 hours all winter. We also have soil moisture loggers, which collect temperature and soil humidity, so basically percent moisture. And then we add a ruler and a camera to collect the depth of the snow at the site. And in the initial versions of this, when I was living in horned lizard country, I would just go out once a week and go to all my sites and measure how deep the snow was. And it was extremely useful and fun, but it's really hard to do from Edmonton. And the cameras do a great job measuring the snow for us. So with the cameras, it makes for a much finer resolution. And as long as they don't fall over, gives us a lot of stuff to look at and a lot of things to work from. So this is actually only just a couple days looking midwinter, right around New Year's. And you can see even in New Year's, it's getting quite warm in places and then getting quite cold. So there's a lot of variation. This site was kind of a weird site, but it was actually the nicest site in terms of camera. So that's why I put this picture up. It was a kind of a weird site because there wasn't much of a good retaining hole at this site. It was just a very weird little male all by himself. But this is what we found, or at least at a couple sites. So this is from some of the initial work before we had the humidity loggers. And I do have to be very cautious to not overstate what this data is worth. This has not been peer reviewed yet. And this data really represents quite a limited number of sites. It takes us a lot of effort to just collect a couple lizards and then put data equipment at each one. So it's going to take us a while to get a massive amount of data. However, the basic statistics on this has shown significance in the sense that lizards tend to choose warmer or more thermally stable sites and sites with more snow. So The red line here is temperature, and that's just showing the temperature from a couple average sites. And then the blue bars are temperature, and you can kind of see it here. It's a little bit hard to interpret, but the control is on the left-hand side. The occupied sites are on the right. And you can see there's more stability on the right-hand side in terms of that red line. It's not bouncing up and down as much as it would in the control site. And then there's quite a bit more snow at these sites that are chosen by the lizards. So we have a pretty good idea that these lizards do seem to be following some of the rules that we had set out in our initial hypotheses. Now, when we look at another site, this site is from further north in Alberta. We see a very similar pattern. So the dotted line on the bottom, that's temperature, and then the solid line on the top is humidity. In this case, the green line is the occupied site, and the red line is the control site. And you can see that there's weirdly more humidity, because I wasn't expecting that in humidity. I didn't make an obvious prediction to you guys, but I did expect them to have fairly low humidity. But the temperature prediction is very similar. It's, again, much more stable right around zero, not bouncing up and down, up and down. And then it hits its lowest point and then just immediately starts getting warmer in March. And we're seeing that it's definitely going below zero. Both years are going below zero, like well below zero, minus 10.2 in this year, and then minus 10.6 in the year prior. And so we have some things we can say based on our initial hypotheses. So even with our limited data, and again, lots of salt to be taken with this, we do have enough data to initially suspect that the lizards are selecting sites with more snow. And these sites appear to have more stable temperatures, but they also appear to be freezing. And so we're getting lizards going down to minus 10, which is weird. Now, it's not that weird, because Alberta does have a couple other species that can freeze. We do live in a cold province, and being able to survive frozen temperatures is probably fairly selectively advantageous. And there's a couple different ways that animals survive. One is to supercool, and that essentially is to use antifreezes of one sort or another to lower the point at which the water freezes in them so that it doesn't freeze. They basically maintain their cell structure in a non-frozen state, but they're below zero. Or freeze tolerance. And there's, again, several ways to accomplish this, but essentially it means you're freezing the cells so that they don't burst, either by removing the water, for the most part, out of the cells, or controlling the size of the crystals in the cells so that they don't rip the cells apart and kill the animal. Freeze tolerance is actually the common method for amphibians. That's largely because they're wet. It's very hard for them to avoid having the nucleizing element of ice, because the soil around them is going to freeze, and they are going to freeze with that soil. So if they're in contact with the soil, it's hard for them to avoid freezing. Depending on where they're from, the frog on the right, the wood frog, can freeze for months. They're kind of at least in North America, they're kind of the kings of freezing. They're really good at freezing. They can go down to minus 20. They can freeze for months. They're really well studied for this, and very, very impressive freezers. In addition, slightly lesser known, our little boreal chorus frogs are actually quite adept at freezing, and they also have that sort of well-developed freeze tolerance. Living, just sort of barely under some thatched grass with a little bit of snow on top of them, they're fine. Now, we also have quite a few reptiles in the province, and supercooling and freeze tolerance is much, much rarer in reptiles, but we do have a couple species that use them, and they actually use both. Red-sided garter snakes are actually quite capable of supercooling, and they have limited freeze tolerance, so they can freeze to modest temperatures, a couple degrees below freezing, for a couple hours. They cannot go very cold, and they probably do not use this as an overwintering tool. It's probably more like insurance. So if you were in Wood Buffalo National Park and you were out in May looking for a mate, it's probably advantageous for you to be able to freeze, 10, 15, 20% of your body without dying, because you never know when a cold snap's going to hit. Um, Painted turtles, on the other hand, do use this as an overwintering strategy. They can supercool down to minus 16, which is really quite impressive, and they can freeze 50% of their body's water. But they can only do this for their first winter, which is some sort of it's a very weird biology. Their adult winter biology is also insane, but the ability to freeze when you're little and then not freeze when you're adult is kind of almost like a genie's curse. Um, they're very weird little animals, but very, very cool. And the adults have also just bonkers biology. A subject for another talk, perhaps. But perhaps the best comparison is another lizard on the far side of the world. So the very boringly named common lizard, found across Europe and Asia, um, it lives very far north, so all through the Scandinavian countries and even into the permafrost regions of Siberia, although it tends not to live actually in the immediate permafrost areas, but lives in these little non-permafrost areas called taliks. Usually it's associated with some sort of water structure or something where the soil is not actually frozen permanently. But these lizards are also shallow overwinterers. They will get down slightly deeper. At times, about 50% of them will use dung beetle holes to get down, but still nowhere near deep enough to get through the frost line. And so this lizard pretty consistently seems to supercool to about 3 degrees temperature, 3 degrees below zero. And then it freezes after that. And it will stay frozen at about minus 10 all through the winter. So there was some serious when I got back the data from the horn lizards and it kept sticking around minus 10. There was some serious deja vu looking at that after reading all these papers about Zootoca. So our observations suggest that something very similar is going on here with our Alberta's greater shorthorn lizard. It does suggest to me that there's some freeze tolerance or some supercooling ability that we haven't processed physiologically. We don't understand that element of it yet. And we might never for this species because that often involves very invasive studies. And this is a species at risk. But we do know that we have observed temperatures near their overwintering sites well below freezing for months at a time. And there's relatively limited freeze thaw cycles, which that stability does suggest to us that it would make a good case for a freezing species. And at minus 10, this would be one of the most cold tolerant amniotes in the world. It'd be up there with those painted turtles, except for it can do it year after year after year. So this species can experience temperatures of 55 plus in its summer habitat. But we think that the thing that's actually limiting its range, the thing that allows it to live in Alberta, is actually that Bearpaw Shale and the fact that we have relatively predictable blown snow conditions in a lot of places in the south. Now, it's looking at the importance of snow for this species. We can't really not think about climate change. I do try to write talks where I don't immediately reference something incredibly sad or dangerous or scary or whatnot about a species, because there's so much interesting biology here to talk about. But I do come from a conservation background. A lot of my work has been on conservation, and I'd be remiss to not use the natural biology to help understand how to conserve a species that's at risk. So I apologize for the pixelated nature of these pictures. I just took them from Poly 2013. And it's a great paper. It talks about snow patterns in the world and how it's changed in the last 40 years. But I wasn't involved in this paper in any way, but it's a really neat paper to read. And this displays the percent of days with snow cover for the month of March. So this is spring snow cover. And so the picture on your left is 1971, and the picture on your right is 2008. And the difference between these two pictures is about 6 million kilometers squared less snow cover. So there's quite a bit less in 2008 than there was in 71. And much of that missing snow cover is actually coming from the area that I've been talking about today, that sort of semi-arid steppe of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Montana. So this may impact species like these lizards, but if it's impacting these lizards, it's also going to be impacting the vegetation and insects around there, and anything else that needs spring moisture, like crops and herds. So ranchers and um, farmers are going to also have some elements of this that are important to look at. And actually, ranchers are one of the groups that have been the most helped with horned lizards because they do need nice open substrates. Now, that country down there has been dry for a long time, and these lizards have persisted. They've persisted through every era that the southern prairies has had. They're extremely tough, and hot and dry is very much on brand for a lizard. But if the cold starts coming before the snow does, or the snow never comes at all, some of these populations will blink out, maybe just from one side of a hill one year and another side of a hill another year, depending on the way the snow blows. And we've seen sort of signals of that in some populations and some places, but it's very hard to pin causation on a decline, especially on a species where you may only see one or two a day. And despite living in a country where winter is the dominant feature and likely limits the ranges of almost all of our species, we know very little about how any of our species overwinter, let alone the role that ephemeral features like snow play. But knowing the importance that snow plays and knowing that we are having changes in our snow patterns is an important step. And I hope that our work is adding to that knowledge, and I hope that it proves useful for planners and managers and landowners. And with that, I also hope you found this talk interesting. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.